Hello, all. So typically, when I assign a film in a class like this, what I say is that I want us to look at the film as a film, and not just as a story, not just like a novel on screen. So I usually encourage students to analyze the film in terms of its cinematic techniques and not just its plot and dialogue. We're actually going to be doing quite a bit of that in the films that we look at later in this class. But today, I'm kind of breaking with my usual priorities, and what I want to focus on is really the Chris McCandless story, or probably more accurately, the Chris McCandless phenomenon. In fact, the decision to assign the film version of Into the Wild is kind of arbitrary. I mean, there's some thought behind it, but there are many different ways I could have done this. There's just a ton of Chris McCandless content out there that we could be looking at. This includes John Krakauer's 1996 book, Into the Wild, which is an expansion of the original article that you read for today and is the basis for the film. There are at least two documentaries. There is also a book based on Chris McCandless's photographs and journal entries called Back to the Wild. And there's also Corinne McCandless's memoir, which was just published in 2014, and it's called The Wild Truth. And there are tons of other essays and articles written by fans and critics of the book, the film, and of McCandless himself. So, in creating the syllabus for the class, I felt like having you watch the film and read Krakauer's original article provided a pretty good sample, especially when accompanied with the Savarin article assigned for Thursday, which talks about the long and often tragic legacy of this story. So, as you've likely already seen, I've provided a quite long but not even exhaustive list of links to more stuff about this. It includes a link to a PDF copy of Krakauer's book, which is really excellent and is a pretty easy read. It's rightfully considered to be a classic of the nonfiction genre. So, if you're interested in diving deeper, then I would probably start with that book. But of course, you can also pick and choose among the articles that I've provided if you decide that you want to pursue this for one of the short essays or even for a final project. There's plenty for you to get started with there. So there's something about this story that really haunts people, and I think a good topic for our discussion today would be just why that is. Why is it that this young man who died now almost 30 years ago continues to generate such an intense response? Almost immediately after the story of Chris McCandless was made public, it generated controversy. In an author's note to the book, Krakauer says that in the weeks and months following the publication of the article in Outside, it generated more mail than any other article in the magazine's history. He says this correspondence, as one might expect, reflected sharply divergent points of view. Some readers admired the boy immensely for his courage and noble ideals. Others fulminated that he was a reckless idiot, a wacko, a narcissist who perished out of arrogance and stupidity, and was undeserving of the considerable media attention he received. And this is a pretty good summary of opinions of McCandless to date. Shortly after the publication of the book, an Alaska park ranger named Peter Christian wrote an essay in which he characterized the young man as mentally ill and suicidal and not worthy of a book length account of his life. Anchorage reporter Craig Medred, who continues to write about McCandless to this day, called him a thieving poacher whose only commendable act was giving his savings to charity. In 2007, he wrote this. He said, Into the Wild is a misrepresentation, a sham, a fraud. There, I finally said what somebody has needed to say for a long time. Krakauer took a poor, misfortunate, prone to paranoia, someone who left a note talking about his desire to kill the false being within, someone who managed to starve to death in a deserted bus not far off the George Parks Highway, and made the guy into a celebrity. Why the author did that should be obvious. He wanted to write a story that would sell. So for Alaskans in particular, McCandless has become kind of a prime example of the foolish outsider, usually male, usually from a privileged background, who comes to the state to test himself in the wilderness and winds up failing or needing rescue or something like that. But there's certainly plenty more nuanced and even celebratory discussion of this story, often from people who identify on some level with the character. For instance, in response to Peter Christian's essay, another Alaska Park ranger named Ken Ilgunas wrote a blog post in which he remembers being a young man very much like McCandless, with similar dreams of seeing, quote, through the eyes of the first Alaskan explorer who didn't carry a map, GPS, or satellite phone. He questions the quickness with which McCandless's critics equate his risk tolerance with a death wish, and what others see as foolishness and unpreparedness, Ilgunas sees as McCandless's decision to come sees Ilgunas sees McCandless's decision to come to Alaska with very little gear as deliberate and principled, even though it was risky. He says McCandless wanted a test, a challenge, and most of all, to immerse himself in nature, that one last refuge of the real in a paved over, smoggy skied century. So while McCandless's death is viewed as a cautionary tale by many, it surely has not stopped people from following in his path. There is now a whole phenomenon of Chris McCandless pilgrims to Alaska who have sought to retrace his steps. In fact, if you do an image search on Google, you will come across several recreations of this famous last photo. And as you will read in the Savrin article for Thursday, this has often had tragic consequences. Two people have died, and at least 15 have had to be rescued on the trail to the so called magic bus. Lest we think that this is strictly a male or strictly an American phenomenon, both of the deaths were of foreign women, one from Switzerland and most recently a woman from Belarus. This has become such a problem that just a few months ago, the bus was airlifted out of the Alaska wilderness to discourage people from trying to visit the site. You can actually watch video of this airlift at one of the links I've provided. The last decade has also seen the emergence of new theories about the cause of McCandless's death. I've provided links to that on Canvas and about his motivations. As I said earlier, in 2014, Corrine McCandless, Chris's sister, published a book called The Wild Truth, in which she reveals very painful details about the McCandless family dynamics that were kept out of Krakauer's original story and book at her request. So in it, she says that her father had a drinking problem that occasionally erupted into violence against both the McCandless children and their mother. And she actually says that her mother later became sort of at least verbally abusive to them as well. The book also explores in greater detail a fact that is in Krakauer's 1996 book, but is not in the article, which is that Walt McCandless had had a second family and had sort of lived a double life before Chris discovered the secret as a teenager. He and Corrine actually had 6 half brothers and sisters who they did not know about until they were adults. So this book recasts Chris's wandering, risk-taking lifestyle in a new light, suggesting that it was motivated primarily by a desire to escape from this toxic home situation. And Krakauer says in a foreword for her book, a lot of people came away from reading Into the Wild without grasping what Chris did, why Chris did what he did. Lacking explicit facts, they concluded that he was merely self-absorbed, unforgivably cruel to his parents, mentally ill, suicidal, and or witless. These revelations make it harder to view his decision to leave his family as a purely selfish one, but it also complicates a little bit this view of his life as one of pure principle. In the online discussion, again, I'm hoping that we can discuss why this story has become such a phenomenon. But since we are also watching the film, I also do invite you to highlight scenes that you found particularly striking and what you think those scenes tell us about the filmmaker's perspective on Chris McCandless. Is this a very celebratory treatment of his life, or does it invite the audience to become more critical of him? And is it fair in what it does? So thank you very much. I will see you in the discussions thread.